The winner of the candidates tournament will face Magnus Carlsen in November in a World Championship match, and I think we have to ask ourselves, who would be the most unpleasant opponent for Carlsen? I mean, the most difficult opponent for Carlsen. And I think certainly one of the younger generation would be the most difficult for Carlsen to meet. And there are a couple of matchups in Moscow today of the younger generation. We had Fabiano Caruana playing Anish Giri, and we also had Sergei Karjakin, who's 26 years old, playing against Hikaru Nakamura, 28 years old, and that's the game we're going to look at. So Karjakin with the white pieces. These two players have quite opposing styles, as we're about to see. Karjakin is pretty steady. Nakamura can be more explosive. He can be more unorthodox. So we have a typical kind of Queen's Indian position on the board after 16 moves. You can see that White has 2 pawns against these 3 on the Queen's side, and White has these 5 pawns here across the board. So absolutely typical. And of course Black has this strong point pawn on d5 in the middle of the board. But Black often has a tricky decision to make in this kind of position. What do you do with the c pawn? Do you leave it on c7? Do you play it c6? Or do you play c5 and go for these kind of hanging pawn positions? So that's one of the big things going on in the position. But yeah, all the pieces, bar a couple of pawns, still on the board. Okay, let's take a look at what happens. So here, for example, thinking about that c pawn, Black could just play c6 here and protect the d pawn, and maybe queen to e7, then rook into the middle. That's an option, or rook to c8. c5, going for the hanging pawns. I think that is very risky when the rook stands opposite the queen. You can see that there's a lot of pressure on potentially on that d pawn, and White very often uses the pins here in this position, and already seems a little bit awkward. So Nakamura played a6. Well, that's to prevent knight b5. Then knight e2 from Karjakin. Well, he's already toying with the idea of playing the knight into c6. For example, queen e7, knight c6, and that knight can be protected on c6. So now, I think understandably, Nakamura decided now is the time to break out with the c pawn. So Karjakin exchanged. Then normally one would like to keep those pawns together, protecting lots of squares in the middle. But as I said before, in this case, it's quite risky to do that. I mean, White could play again. Knight c4 is interesting. Maybe just rook c1. Queen f5 is very interesting, putting some pressure on the knight on f6 and hoping to provoke the weakening move g6. So instead Nakamura played knight takes c5. It's a much safer way to play, looking to lock the knight into e4, and that blocks out the bishop on g2 to some extent. So knight d3, but Karjakin just plays very steadily. Obviously that knight was attacked on e5. Very steady play from Karjakin. He knows that he doesn't need to press too hard here, because he has a long-term positional advantage in this isolated pawn. I mean, generally I like to play with isolated queen's pawns because they give you space. They perhaps allow you to play the knight into e4. There are sometimes attacking chances, but here I definitely prefer Karjakin's position because his king is very well protected. Pawn on g3, locking out that bishop. Control of d4, very nice. That bishop locked in behind the d pawn. Certainly White has a positional advantage here. So knight e4, good stuff from Nakamura. That knight is solidly protected. Whoops, I didn't mean to misfire there. The knight is solidly protected by the bishop and by the pawn and by the knight. So that locks out the bishop. Even so, White can build up very steadily here. So let's reach the kind of critical moment in the game. Nakamura bringing his pieces out. Queen e7, connecting rooks. Bishop to d4. Okay, this is very nice. With that pawn on a6, of course, it has weakened the b6 pawn, and the bishop just hitting that sensitive pawn. Nakamura traded rooks and played b5, but that leaves some weakened dark squares here, and Karjakin seized on that. b4, excellent moves. That locks those pawns. Perhaps later on can shift the knight into c5. Okay, Nakamura manoeuvring now. a3, getting nice and steady from Karjakin. You know, this is typical of him. He's for me, he's a very kind of formal, plays in a very formal style, classic Russian school of chess. You know, plays very positionally. So he's just building up very slowly. So the bishop drops back. You want to keep that bishop. Of course, nothing wrong with it in the corner. It's on a very good diagonal. And the queen comes to a2. You know, maybe just looking at that pawn. Round about here, the clock time's 20 minutes for Karjakin, 15 minutes for Nakamura remaining to get to the time control on move 40. Still 13 moves to make, so bit of pressure on Nakamura. Now he shifted his bishop to b6, hitting the important d4 square. Karjakin played h4, again nice and steady, taking away the g5 square from a potential, you know, knight g5, and you know, sometimes gives the king a square on h2. This is nice and steady from Karjakin. And here Nakamura rather panicked. I think he could feel that in the long term he was going to have to suffer here. He said that after the game that he'd considered exchanging all the pieces on d4, and after this he said, well, this isn't too much advantage for white. But I think he realised it might not be too much advantage, but it is a long-term, steady advantage for white. That knight might sit in on c5, looking at the a6 pawn. That bishop, not a good piece. No doubt that white is better here. I think Nakamura realised that and started to look for tactical possibilities. And he took on g3. Well, this is make or break. But after the game, Nakamura said, I lost my mind. Well, not kidding. Let's see what his idea was. So he sacked piece, but his idea was to trade on d4. And after queen e3 check, he thought he was winning the piece back. So, for example, king h2, you take the knight on d3. Or knight f2, you take the rook. That's all fine. But Karjakin, of course, had looked at this. If you play a move like h4, weakening the g3 pawn, then of course you're going to look at this sacrifice, and Karjakin had seen a bit further. He blocks with the queen. Nakamura took the knight, and now rook c7, a simple double attack, hitting the bishop, hitting the pawn on f7, threatening mate, and it's all over. White has a winning position. The game didn't last too much longer. I mean, Nakamura just looked distraught at this point. Well, he played on f5. Karjakin took the bishop. h6 from Nakamura. I mean, you know, he can't even throw the rook in at the moment because bishop d5 would just be absolutely deadly. So he played h6 first, just giving his king a square, but bishop d5 anyway. King came up the board, and Karjakin, super solid, just brought the bishop back to g2. There's no danger that the bishop protects the king. I mean, Nakamura's completely lost it. He played rook e2, and after bishop f1, he had to resign. Let's just see very quickly why he resigned. Well, rook takes queen, bishop takes, obviously force. Well, once the queens are off, it's easy. But let me just show you a quick variation. Rook f3, let's put the bishop back, and let's say, well, rook takes g3, king f2. I mean, black can take lots of pawns here, but it really doesn't matter. Bishop f5 check leaves the king in desperate straits. So king back, bishop g6, and you can see even mate is threatened, and in combination with the d pawn, utterly lost for black. So disaster for Nakamura, but I had the feeling he kind of panicked in this position. I think he just found himself in the wrong kind of position. That he realised that, he positionally he was worse, and I think that induced a kind of panic in him actually, and obviously this is just a mistaken calculation, and Karjakin mopped up. So I think he just got the wrong position after the opening. He played into Karjakin's steady hands. So after 2 rounds, there are 2 players sharing the lead: Sergei Karjakin and Viswanathan Anand. They both have 1.5 out of 2. All the other games were drawn today. I mentioned the game between Caruana and Giri. This threatened to become very interesting actually. Caruana certainly had the advantage, but he ran short of time and basically liquidated into a drawn endgame. So it was interesting, but not interesting enough. Okay, thanks for watching, folks. I'll be posting regular reports after each round, and hopefully I'll be a bit more punctual next time. Thanks a lot.